Welcome back to In the Studio with Kevin Savage, a podcast for producers. And in today's episode, we are going to discuss the history of music distribution. As we discussed in our previous segment, the next few episodes of this podcast and episodes on YouTube are going to cover music distribution, everything from its history, where it came from, where it is, to the present, where it is, what it's doing, to the future, where it appears to be headed, and what sorts of things are on the horizon. We'll also probably be following up this little mini-series, following up this history portion with the what it looks like on the front of the foreign marketplaces, because I think that is something important to think about when we think about music distribution and we think about content creation and the evolution and changes that things are going through. So I hope you enjoy this. Make sure to check out the next 3 episodes or 4 episodes to be able to get the full picture of everything. And I apologize if my voice is a little hoarse. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. So, excuse me. So have a little bit of coffee. Put this right here. There we go. So, music distribution. Like anything else, really, from art to architecture to nutrition fads, it evolves. If you take anything away from the series, I hope it'll be that evolution is a law of nature, and it is a reality, just like a man standing in front of a locomotive with no brakes, either get out of the way or prepare to hop on or die. Unfortunately, too often, the titans of industry are unwilling to adapt, and thus they reap the negative consequences. So, music distribution originally originated as a way to sell furniture. Gramophones specifically, they brought in blues and opera singers, had recorded them, and used that to market the hardware. And like anything else, over time that evolved. I mean, you don't have many people with gramophones in their homes. Now, from there, we see that vinyl, then cassettes, then CDs, and finally digital downloads and streaming, which is where we're at now. I don't know about you, but I can't remember the last time I actually purchased a finished piece of music hardware when it comes to like CDs or vinyls or cassettes. I think that probably likely applies to you too, but I could be wrong. I think the times that I have, which was probably about 4 years ago, was when I watched an underground band that I really liked called Potbelly, and the only way to really get their music was to buy their records because they weren't available on the streaming platforms. That was also 2013, 2014, so streaming music had changed dramatically since then. And I think, honestly, that was the last time that I bought, physical music to consume. And honestly, those records, they sit on my shelf. I don't really have access to a record player right now, and I think a lot of the reason why I bought it was probably because I really liked the album art and really wanted to support the band. I think music as a souvenir is not a marketable business model, at least to me. So it makes sense why when we look at the charts, physical music sales have dropped and digital downloads and streaming have nearly caught up when it comes to music consumption. Now, record companies, Gatekeepers, the series is called The Gatekeepers, How They've Fallen, I think are terrified at this notion, and that honestly makes sense. Them and their artists have had a leg up on independent producers and small record labels because they have more on-hand capital, and they can invest in distribution and marketing, and they can get songs on the radio, whereas independent artists and labels can't, or at least they can't to the same extent. I think this explosion of streaming is what I like to call the great equalizer. Now, are smaller artists and labels without a handicap now? Of course not. The bigger labels and artists have access to more tools. Radio still exists, and they have their connections there. They have name recognition. They have more money to invest in marketing and advertisement. They can play at all the big clubs and festivals. They have access to great studios, equipment, and session musicians to make their tracks honestly pretty close to perfect. But in many ways, that gate, the thing that these titans of industries have guarded so firmly, is under siege, and it's beginning to crumble. And personally, I think that's a good thing. I think it's beautiful. Music isn't alone. We see the same in publishing, in journalism, and new media. Political commentary isn't just stuck on MSNBC or CNN or Fox, but now we can go to YouTube and podcasts for our news. We can go to Medium or blogs to get our print, and Twitter and other social media platforms, if we build an organic following, can honestly be a great opportunity for free or cheap advertising. Now, this democratization of multimedia, I think, is really changing the way that we think about culture. And in this series, I'm looking forward to eventually brainstorming what the future might look like, considering the current trajectory we are on. But before we do that, that's for a later episode, let's dive a little deeper onto music distribution specifically. When we get to the next few episodes, I think it's important to share a common foundation so that when we discuss the present and the future, we're all on the same page. This won't be all-encompassing, and in future episodes, when we discuss in more depth on labels and music business side of things, some things might be a little clearer. But for now, if you have any questions about what I'm talking about, Google it. Shoot me a DM on Twitter at kevinsavage.nyc, or if you're here on YouTube, leave me a comment. Now, I think there is at some point in which where we need to draw a line. For the purpose of this analysis, we'll be drawing a line at recorded music as distribution. In my research, many pieces of music history draw the line at sheet music as music distribution, and while I think this is definitely accurate, it's easy to keep looking further and further and further back in history to find that line to draw, even back to the days when music or art was passed on like theater as just storytelling, playing a sound, showing someone how to play the sound, that person shows it to the next person, etc., or telling a story, and then the next generation tells a story to the next generation, etc. So, I think the best time, I think the best thing to do is to draw the line as when we recorded, because honestly, if we go back to sheet music, we're looking at like the 1940s, or excuse me, the 1470s and 1473, which was the last time music was printed on sheet music. I think that is a good point for a lot of historians, but for our purposes, so that this podcast isn't, insanely long, we draw the line a little closer to the 1900s. You could spend like a whole semester on the intricacies of, the history of music composition and its evolution. I say that because I took a semester while I was at Columbia on masterpieces of Western music, and the majority of that semester was dedicated to, early music history and stuff like that. So let's skip forward a few centuries and get to the late 1900s when the first recording devices were made. Now, it's important to note that the change and evolution in music distribution honestly is as inherent to its core as the instruments that are used. So, stringed instruments, pianos, they evolve, specifically pianos, have evolved, to analog synthesizers and to eventually to VST. And this evolution from, instruments that are played on a physical instrument, shifting into, an analog synthesizer that replicates that same sound or replicates it as close as possible, to, digital VSTs where it's almost entirely synthesized and doesn't require any analog gear, is that evolution that we're talking about, and how, it's present in everything. Now, the first iteration of the record player, a phonograph, was invented by Thomas Edison in 1877. And like any new piece of hardware, it's expensive. And its rarity meant that people visited phonograph parlors. And by 1890, to experience that new technology, when you think of the phonograph and phonograph parlors, you can think of a very basic jukebox with poor audio quality. Now, we won't get into the process of the device, perhaps another episode on it, but moving many years forward, it wasn't until the 1930s. Excuse me. It wasn't until the 1930s when vinyl record became the go-to form of music distribution and consumption, and this honestly lasted most of the 20th century. A point to consider when considering the evolution of distribution is that it's evolved exponentially. It started off small and it's kind of inched its way, and then as it's gotten closer and as we hit the 1900s, it just explodes. It took nearly 500 years for music to shift from written to recorded as distribution, and then another 40 years for music distribution to shift from something that a few could experience to something many could. Then in the late 70s, cassettes took over from vinyl. 40 more years from about 40 more years. There was a brief stint of 8 tracks, then cassette or compact discs took over in the 1990s. We got 20 years or so. Then MP3s in the late 1990s and early 2000s, so you got another 10 years or so. And finally in 2008, Spotify launched, less than 10 years. So this growth from 500 to 40 to 40 to 20 to 10 to less than 10 just really shows that exponential growth that and evolution that I was mentioning. So, I think that speed and, when we think about the generations of people who lived between these times is just really interesting. If you were born in the phonograph era, phonograph parlor era, you would have lived half your life with no real access to recorded sound at your fingertips. Just think about that, Then halfway through your life, vinyl becomes the norm. If you're born the day that phonographs were released, 40 years later, you're a grown adult with children, and suddenly phonographs, vinyl is available. And then, if you live, until you're 80 or 100 or so, you've got, 20 years, like as you're old and senile, experiencing, a whole new form of music distribution. If you've lived that long, juxtapose that with people like myself who were born at the tail end of the cassette era, and I've experienced a shift from cassettes to CDs to MP3 to streaming, all in, and I'm 30 years old. Like it's incredible that, I've experienced 30 years of life with so much change, where some of these people could have experienced their entire life with very little change. But what does this rapid shift in distribution mean for the industry? So after we get back from the break, we'll go ahead and we'll continue discussing.